The city of Havensbridge woke beneath a thick veil of fog, the kind that seemed to blur the edges of buildings and faces, leaving everything slightly unreal. At the heart of this sprawling metropolis stood the Harrington Tower, an architectural marvel of glass and steel. Inside, the offices buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the gray stillness outside. Among the countless employees moving through the building like clockwork, there was one figure often overlooked: Rosa, the cleaning lady. Rosa's life was a routine she could navigate blindfolded. Her mornings began at 4:30 a.m., when she'd shuffle out of her tiny apartment, careful not to wake her teenage son, Matteo. She'd catch the first bus downtown, her hands clutching a thermos of coffee like a lifeline against the chill. Once at the tower, she slipped into the shadows of the workplace hierarchy, an invisible presence that swept, wiped, and emptied the remnants of others' lives. Despite her invisibility, Rosa had a warmth about her, a quiet kindness that those who took the time to notice found soothing. But kindness didn't pay bills. Her days were a constant balance between exhaustion and the fierce determination to secure a better future for Matteo, who dreamed of becoming an architect. On the top floor of the Harrington Tower, where polished mahogany gleamed under track lighting and the air smelled faintly of leather and power, resided its owner, Graham Harrington. A self-made millionaire, Graham was the kind of man people simultaneously admired and envied. His sharp suits, commanding presence, and relentless drive had propelled him to unimaginable heights. But there was another side to Graham that few ever saw. Beneath his confident exterior was a man quietly haunted by his past. Nights alone in his penthouse often stretched endlessly, filled with the echo of unspoken regrets. His wealth and achievements were a fortress, shielding him from a world he no longer trusted. One evening, as Rosa finished tidying up the executive offices, she noticed Graham sitting in the darkened boardroom, his head in his hands. Something about the scene made her pause. He looked nothing like the towering figure who barked orders during the day. In that moment, he seemed fragile, almost human. She hesitated before clearing her throat softly. "Mr. Harrington?" Startled, he looked up, his eyes narrowing as though trying to place her. "What is it?" His tone was sharp, defensive. Rosa faltered but pressed on. "It's late, sir. I just thought maybe you'd want to go home. Being here alone, it's not good for the soul." Her words hung in the air like a strange melody, unexpected and raw. Graham stared at her, unsure whether to be annoyed or intrigued. "And what would you know about my soul?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and dismissal. Rosa met his gaze steadily. "Probably nothing, but I've seen enough people to know when someone's carrying something heavy. Sometimes, it's safer to talk to a stranger." Her honesty startled him. For a moment, Graham considered brushing her off, but something about the cleaning lady's quiet confidence made him pause. "I'm fine," he said at last, his voice softer. "You should go home." Rosa nodded and left, but as she rode the bus back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the image of Graham's weary face. She whispered a prayer for him, unsure why she cared. That night, Rosa dreamed of a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into a void. When she woke, the dream lingered, filling her with unease. Little did she know, the seeds of an extraordinary connection had been sown. The next morning, as Rosa arrived at the tower, her breath caught in her throat. Parked in front of her building was a sleek black luxury car, its polished surface reflecting the pale dawn light. As she stepped closer, her eyes widened. A small envelope lay on the windshield, addressed simply to her. Rosa's hand trembled as she picked up the envelope. The thick, cream-colored paper felt out of place against her calloused fingers. Glancing around, she half expected someone to jump out and explain this surreal scene. But the street was quiet, save for the faint hum of passing cars. She opened the envelope carefully, as though afraid to tear the moment apart. Inside was a single handwritten note on embossed stationery. The bold, elegant script read, "A token of gratitude for your words last night. J.H." Her breath caught. J.H. Graham Harrington. The realization hit her like a gust of wind. She looked at the car again, its leather interior gleaming through the windows. "Impossible," she whispered. Her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, appeared at her side, her grocery bags swaying as she walked. "Mija, is that yours?" she asked, her eyes wide. Rosa shook her head vehemently. "No, no, it must be some mistake." But as she said it, a young man in a sharp black suit approached. "Mrs. Martinez?" Her heart pounded. "Yes." He handed her a set of keys and gestured to the car. "Mr. Harrington asked me to deliver this. He insisted it belongs to you now." Before Rosa could argue, the man turned and walked away briskly, leaving her standing dumbfounded in the cool morning air. At work, Rosa could barely concentrate. Her mind swirled with questions. Why would Graham Harrington give her a car? What could he possibly gain from this? The day dragged on, her routine punctuated by the whispered gossip of her coworkers. The news of the mysterious car had spread quickly. "Maybe she's his secret mistress," one of them speculated, loud enough for Rosa to hear. "She probably knows something about him," another said. Rosa ignored them, focusing on her tasks. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm brewed. She didn't want charity, especially not from a man like Graham. Felt wrong, as if the car carried an invisible weight she wasn't ready to bear. By the time Rosa finished her shift, the fog had lifted, replaced by a cold, clear evening. She made her way to the top floor, where Graham's office was bathed in the warm glow of his desk lamp. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't expecting you." Rosa hesitated before stepping forward, the car keys clutched tightly in her hand. "Mr. Harrington, I came to return these." His brow furrowed. "Why?" Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Because I don't understand why you gave me that car. I'm just a cleaning lady. I don't need gifts like that." Graham studied her for a long moment, his piercing gaze making her feel exposed. Then he stood and walked to the window, his silhouette framed against the city lights. "You were right," he said quietly. "About what?" "About carrying something heavy." The admission startled her. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her words, much less open up. He turned to face her, his expression softer now. "Last night you said it's easier to talk to a stranger. I didn't believe you then, but I've been thinking about it all day." Rosa didn't respond, sensing he wasn't done. "For years, I've built walls around myself. I thought success would make everything better, that it would erase certain things." His voice faltered, and he looked away. "But it doesn't. If anything, it makes the silence louder." Rosa felt a pang of sympathy. She stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Mr. Harrington, you don't owe me anything. I only spoke from the heart." "That's exactly why I gave you the car," he said, meeting her eyes. "Because you spoke from the heart when no one else does. It's rare. And it reminded me of someone I used to know." Rosa frowned. "Who?" His jaw tightened. "Someone I lost." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken pain. For a moment, Rosa saw not the untouchable millionaire, but a man fighting to keep his grief from consuming him. "Keep the car," Graham said finally, his voice firm. "It's not charity. It's my way of saying thank you for seeing me." Rosa opened her mouth to protest but stopped. There was a rawness in his eyes that silenced her. She nodded slowly, realizing this wasn't about the car at all. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." As she left his office, her mind buzzed with questions. Who had he lost? And why did her words affect him so deeply? She had a feeling this was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The luxury car sat parked outside Rosa's apartment, gleaming under the streetlights like a silent enigma. Each time she glanced at it through her window, unease rippled through her chest. She had never owned anything so extravagant, and the thought of driving it made her palms sweat. Yet, Graham's words lingered in her mind. "It's not charity. It's my way of saying thank you." The next morning, as Rosa prepared for work, her son Mateo came into the kitchen, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He He stopped abruptly at the sight of the car keys on the counter. "Mom, what are those?" he asked, pointing. Rosa hesitated. "A gift," she said simply, hoping he wouldn't press further. Mateo's eyes widened. "A gift? From who?" "It's a long story," she replied, brushing past him to pour his coffee. Her evasion only fueled his curiosity. "You don't just get a car out of nowhere, Mom. What's going on?" Rosa sighed, turning to face him. "It's from someone I work for. He wanted to thank me for something I said." Mateo frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. Are you sure it's safe? What if he expects something in return?" His concern touched her, but she shook her head. "He doesn't. It's complicated, Mateo. But I promise it's all right." Her words did little to ease his unease, but he let it drop for now. At work, the whispers followed Rosa like shadows. Every glance seemed laced with judgment, every murmur charged with suspicion. She kept her head down, scrubbing surfaces and emptying trash bins as though the weight of their gossip couldn't touch her. By the time her shift ended, she felt drained. She decided to take the car for a drive, not because she wanted to, but because Mateo's earlier words nagged at her. She needed to understand why Graham had chosen her, of all people, for such a grand gesture. That evening, Rosa drove through the city's labyrinth of streets, the smooth hum of the engine an unfamiliar sensation. The car was too perfect, too pristine, like wearing a dress that didn't quite fit. As she turned onto a quieter road, her thoughts drifted to Graham's words about someone he had lost. Who was this person? And why had her simple words about the soul stirred something in him? Her musings were interrupted by the sight of flashing lights ahead. Police checkpoint. Rosa's chest tightened as she slowed to a stop. The officer approached, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "License and registration, please." Rosa fumbled nervously. I just got the car," she stammered. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Just got it?" "Yes, it was a gift." His skepticism was evident. "A gift? From who?" She hesitated. "From my employer." The officer's expression didn't soften, but he nodded and took her documents to his car. Rosa gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding. She felt exposed, as though the car itself had placed her under a spotlight she didn't ask for. When the officer returned, he handed her documents back. "Everything checks out, ma'am. Drive safely." Rosa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and continued on her way. The next day, Rosa's shift ended later than usual. As she stepped out of the tower, she noticed Graham standing near the front entrance, speaking to someone on his phone. He caught sight of her and ended the call abruptly. "Mrs. Martinez," he called out, walking toward her. Rosa stopped, her pulse quickening. "Mr. Harrington." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Have you been driving the car?" "Yes," she admitted. "But I need to ask, why me? Why now?" Graham hesitated, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "Because you remind me of someone." Her brow furrowed. "Who?" He took a deep breath, as though steadying himself. "Her name was Marisol. She worked for my family when I was a child. She was like a second mother to me." Rosa's heart softened. "What happened to her?" Graham's jaw tightened. "She died when I was 13. Car accident. But before that, she was the only person who ever made me feel seen. She used to say things like you did, about the soul, about not letting the world harden you." Rosa felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded, his expression distant. "I thought I'd buried those memories a long time ago, but when you spoke to me that night, it brought everything back. I don't know why, but it felt right to do something for you. Maybe it's my way of honoring her." The rawness in his voice struck her deeply. For the first time, she understood the depth of his gesture. The car wasn't just a gift. It was a bridge between past and present, a way for Graham to reconcile with the ghost of someone he had loved and lost. "Thank you for telling me," Rosa said softly. Graham nodded, but his expression remained clouded. "There's more," he said after a pause. "About Marisol. About my family. Things I've never told anyone. Rosa's heart skipped. What kind of things? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not here. Not now. The mystery deepened, and Rosa knew she couldn't let it go. Whatever secrets Graham carried, they were tied to more than just his past. They were tied to hers, though she couldn't yet see how. The following days unfolded like a slow unraveling of a tightly wound thread. Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that her chance encounter with Graham was leading her somewhere she wasn't yet ready to go. The luxury car stood as a constant reminder, a gleaming presence in her otherwise humble life. Matteo, though still wary, seemed fascinated by it, often running his fingers along its sleek exterior. Maybe it's a sign, he said one morning over breakfast. A sign of what? Rosa asked, raising an eyebrow. That things are changing for us, Matteo replied, his tone hopeful. Rosa forced a smile, unwilling to dampen his optimism, though unease still tugged at her. Something about Graham's story lingered in her mind. His mention of Marisol, the way her name had fallen from his lips like a sacred memory. One evening, after work, Rosa found herself lingering outside Graham's office again. She had promised herself she wouldn't get involved, but the questions swirled in her mind like an unrelenting storm. Finally, she knocked on the door. "Come in," came Graham's voice. She entered, her footsteps hesitant. Graham sat at his desk, reviewing documents, but he set them aside when he saw her. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need to know more," Rosa said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "About what?" "About Marisol. About why you chose to tell me about her." Graham studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're persistent," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I just feel like there's something you're not saying, and it's been on my mind." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "There is more. But it's not an easy story to tell." "I'm here to listen," Rosa said, her voice soft but resolute. Graham stood and walked to the window, his gaze distant as he began to speak. "Marisol worked for my family when I was a boy. She wasn't just the housekeeper. She was the glue that held everything together. My parents were always too busy, too wrapped up in their own lives to pay attention to me. But Marisol, she saw me. She cared in a way no one else did." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But my family wasn't kind to her. They treated her like she was invisible, like her life didn't matter beyond what she could do for them. I hated it, and so did she." Rosa listened intently, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "One night," Graham continued, "Marisol told me she was leaving. She said she couldn't stay in a house where she wasn't respected. She hugged me goodbye and promised we'd see each other again someday. But we never did. She died in a car accident a week later." His voice broke slightly, and he cleared his throat. "I found out later that she'd been driving to meet someone. A man she'd loved but had been forced to leave behind years earlier." Rosa's heart skipped. Something about the story felt eerily familiar, but she couldn't place why. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked cautiously. Graham turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "That's the part one don't fully understand. But when I first really saw you, it was like seeing her again. Not just in the way you look, but in the way you carry yourself, the way you speak. It's uncanny." Rosa's breath hitched. "You think I remind you of her?" "Yes," he said simply. The room fell silent as Rosa tried to process his words. Could it be possible that her path had crossed Graham's for a reason far deeper than either of them realized? "Did Marisol ever tell you anything about her past?" Rosa asked finally, her voice trembling. Graham nodded. "She mentioned a village in Mexico. She said she'd left behind a child there." The words hit Rosa like a thunderclap. She staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the chair for support. "Are you all right?" Graham asked, stepping toward her. I think I need to sit down," she whispered. Graham helped her into a chair, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" Rosa stared at him, her mind racing. The name Marisol, the mention of a village, a child left behind. It couldn't be. But the possibility lodged itself in her mind, refusing to let go. My mother's name was Marisol, Rosa said quietly, her voice trembling. Graham froze. What? She left when I was very young, Rosa continued. I was raised by my grandmother. She told me my mother had gone north to find work, but she never came back. I always thought she abandoned me. Graham's face paled. Rosa, are you saying? I don't know, Rosa interrupted, her voice rising. But what if it's her? What if your Marisol and my mother are the same person? The room seemed to tilt as the weight of her words settled between them. Graham sank into the chair across from her, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. If that's true, he began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. Rosa felt tears welling in her eyes. For years, she had carried the pain of her mother's absence, believing it to be a choice. But if Graham's story was true, then everything she thought she knew about her past was a lie. The threads of their lives, once seemingly disconnected, were beginning to weave together in a way neither could have imagined. The air in the office felt charged, heavy with the weight of Rosa's revelation. Graham stared at her, his mind racing to connect the fragments of their shared history. Rosa sat frozen, the truth trembling just out of reach. I need to know, Rosa said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to know if it's her. Graham nodded, his expression serious. There has to be a way to find out. They sat in silence for a moment before Rosa spoke again. You said she mentioned a village. Do you remember the name? Graham thought hard, his brow furrowing. It was a long time ago, but I think she called it San Jacinto. Rosa's breath hitched. San Jacinto. It was the village where she had been born, the place she had left behind as a child. The pieces were falling into place faster than she could process. That's my village, Rosa said, her voice trembling. It has to be her. Graham's eyes widened. Then we need to dig deeper. There must be records, something that can confirm this. Rosa nodded, her heart pounding. I'll talk to my grandmother. She might know something. That evening, Rosa sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she dialed her grandmother's number. The phone rang twice before the familiar, warm voice answered. Rosa, mi nina, ¿cómo estás? Her grandmother said, her voice filled with affection. I'm fine, abuela, Rosa replied, though her voice betrayed her nerves. I need to ask you something about my mother. There was a pause. Your mother? Her grandmother said cautiously. Yes. Do you remember anything about where she went or why she left? Her grandmother sighed, the sound heavy with years of unspoken pain. She went north to work, Rosa. She wanted to give you a better life. That's all I ever knew. Did she ever mention someone named Graham or a family she worked for? Rosa pressed. Her grandmother paused again, this time longer. She wrote me a letter once, she said finally. It was a few months before the accident. She mentioned working for a rich family. She said the boy she cared for was like a son to her. Rosa's heart raced. Do you still have the letter? I might, her grandmother said. It's in a box with her other things. I'll look for it. Thank you, abuela, Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. This means so much to me. The next day, Rosa relayed the conversation to Graham. He listened intently, his face a mix of hope and apprehension. If we find that letter, he said, it might be the proof we need. Rosa nodded, but a deeper question gnawed at her. If it's true, if she really is my mother, why didn't she ever come back for me? Graham's expression softened. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she thought she was protecting you. Rosa shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. But she left me. She didn't have to. Graham hesitated before speaking. I know how much that hurts, but Marisol wasn't the kind of person who would abandon someone she loved. If she didn't come back, there must have been a reason. His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the ache in Rosa's chest. She nodded, unable to speak. A week later, Rosa's grandmother called. "I found the letter," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you want me to send it to you?" "Yes," Rosa said, her heart pounding. "Please." The letter arrived 2 days later, and Rosa opened it with shaking hands. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Her mother's handwriting was neat and precise, the words carrying a bittersweet intimacy. "Dear Mama, life here is difficult, but I have found work with a kind family. The boy I care for reminds me of Rosa. He is so full of life, so curious about the world. Sometimes I feel like I am doing the right thing, giving Rosa a chance at something better. But other times I wonder if I made a mistake. I miss her so much it hurts. I met someone here, someone I loved long ago. I can't say more yet, but I hope he will help me bring Rosa to a better life. Please tell her I love her more than anything in this world. Tell her I will come back for her." Rosa's tears blurred the words. She handed the letter to Graham, who read it silently, his expression unreadable. "She loved you," Graham said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She never stopped." Rosa wiped her tears. "But she didn't come back. Why?" Graham looked at her, his jaw tightening. "We need to find out what happened in those final days. Someone must know the truth." The mystery of Marisol's past deepened as Rosa and Graham began piecing together the story. Every discovery brought them closer, not just to understanding Marisol's life, but to confronting their own wounds. For Rosa, it was the pain of abandonment. For Graham, it was the guilt of losing the only person who had ever truly cared for him. But neither of them was prepared for the secrets that lay ahead. The letter opened a door Rosa hadn't known existed, a door to memories she had buried so deep they felt like fragments of someone else's life. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind through the words on the paper, a bittersweet melody of love and regret. But the letter only deepened the mystery. Why hadn't Marisol returned? Who was the man she mentioned? And how had her life ended so abruptly? Graham, too, seemed haunted by the letter. It was as if the Marisol he had idolized and the Marisol Rosa had mourned were two sides of the same woman. Yet neither of them fully understood her. The next step was clear. They needed answers. Rosa and Graham agreed to travel to San Jacinto, the village where Marisol's story began. Rosa had not returned since she left as a child, and the idea of revisiting the place stirred a strange mix of anticipation and dread. When they arrived, the village greeted them with the smell of wood smoke and the sight of brightly colored houses nestled against rolling hills. Children played in the dusty streets, their laughter carried on the wind. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming city Rosa now called home, but something about it felt achingly familiar. "Where do we start?" Graham asked as they stood in the village square, its centerpiece a weathered fountain surrounded by benches. Rosa took a deep breath. "We start with my grandmother." Her grandmother's house sat on the edge of the village, its modest frame shaded by a towering mango tree. When Rosa knocked, the door creaked open to reveal the frail but resolute woman she remembered so vividly. Her grandmother's face lit up with surprise and joy. "Rosa!" she exclaimed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You came." "Yes, abuela," Rosa said, tears prickling her eyes. "I came to find the truth." Her grandmother's gaze flicked to Graham, who stood quietly nearby. Rosa introduced him, though her grandmother's sharp eyes seemed to piece together his significance before she said a word. "You're the boy," her grandmother said, her voice tinged with both wonder and sadness. "The one from her letters." Graham nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And I'm here because I owe her so much." The old woman's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Come inside." Seated around the kitchen table, Rosa's grandmother recounted the pieces of Marisol's life that she knew. Marisol had left San Jacinto to escape the poverty and stigma of being a single mother. Her hope was to earn enough money to bring Rosa north and provide her with a better life. But then her letters had stopped. "I thought she had forgotten us," her grandmother admitted, her voice trembling. "But now I know there was more to the story." Rosa showed her the letter they had found, and her grandmother nodded. "This man she mentioned, he was from the village, a boy she loved before you were born. His name was Emilio. But his family moved to the city, and Marisol stayed behind. She always said he was her first love. Rosa's pulse quickened. Do you know what happened to him? Her grandmother shook her head. After she left for the north, I never heard about him again. Graham leaned forward. Do you think he could have been the reason she didn't come back? Maybe something happened between them. Her grandmother's face clouded with uncertainty. I don't know, but someone in the village might remember. The next few hours were spent walking through the village, asking the elders for any information about Emilio or Marisol's time there. Most had only vague memories, but one woman, Dona Sofia, remembered Emilio well. He was a good boy, she said, sitting on her porch with a shawl draped over her shoulders. But his family was very proud. They didn't approve of Marisol because she was from a poorer background. Do you know what happened to him after he left the village? Rosa asked. Sophia nodded. He came back once many years later. I remember because he looked so sad. He asked about Marisol, but by then, she was already gone. Rosa's chest tightened. Gone? Gone where? To the city, Sophia replied. I told him she had left for a better life. He seemed heartbroken. I never saw him again after that. That night, back at her grandmother's house, Rosa and Graham sat in the small living room, processing the day's revelations. It's like chasing shadows, Rosa said, her frustration evident. Every time we get closer, the truth slips away. Graham leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. There's one thing we know for certain. Emilio and Marisol's paths crossed again. It must have been in the city after she left here. If we can find out what happened to him, we might find the missing piece. Rosa nodded, though her exhaustion was palpable. I just want to know why she never came back for me. Why she didn't keep her promise. Graham's gaze softened. We'll find out, Rosa. Whatever it takes. Late that night, Rosa sat alone on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine. The village was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant rustle of leaves. She thought of her mother, young, hopeful, and full of dreams that had somehow unraveled. For the first time, Rosa allowed herself to imagine a different version of her mother. Not the woman who had abandoned her, but someone who had been trapped by circumstances beyond her control. As the stars shimmered above, Rosa whispered, I'll find the truth, Mama. I'll bring your story back to life. Inside, Graham watched her through the window, a mix of admiration and sadness in his eyes. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it in his heart. This journey wasn't just about Rosa finding her mother's truth. It was about both of them finding redemption, and maybe even healing the broken pieces of their own lives. The next morning, Rosa and Graham left San Jacinto with more questions than answers, but also a fragile hope. The pieces of Marisol's story pointed to the city, where her past had intertwined with Emilio's. It was a trail as faint as a shadow, but it was all they had. As the car sped through winding roads, Rosa stared out the window, lost in thought. Graham broke the silence. When we get back, I'll have my team look into Emilio. If he left any records behind, we'll find them. Rosa nodded, though doubt lingered in her mind. What if we don't? What if this leads to nothing? Graham glanced at her, his expression firm. It won't. I won't let it. His determination steadied her, though she couldn't help but wonder why he cared so deeply. Was it guilt? A need for closure? Or was there something more that neither of them fully understood yet? Back in the city, Graham wasted no time. His assistant, Daniel, a meticulous man with a knack for research, began digging into Emilio's life. Rosa, meanwhile, returned to work, though her mind was elsewhere. Every sweep of the broom and clink of the trash bin felt mechanical, her thoughts consumed by the unraveling mystery. Late one afternoon, Graham called her into his office. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Anticipation. Maybe. Daniel found something, he said. Rosa's heart raced. What? A record of a man named Emilio Delgado. He moved to the city around the time Marisol left San Jacinto. He worked odd jobs and eventually became a driver for a wealthy family. Graham paused, his voice softening. It's the same family Marisol worked for. Rosa's eyes widened. They were together again? Graham nodded. It seems so, but there's more. He handed her a worn photograph. It was grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. Marisol stood in the center, holding a child no older than 2, her face radiant with joy. Emilio stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Rosa's breath caught. Who is the child? Graham's expression darkened. That's what we need to find out. The photograph led them to a small archival office, where records of the wealthy family Marisol and Emilio had worked for were stored. After hours of searching, Rosa found an old ledger with their names listed as employees. Scribbled in the margins was a brief note. Marisol and Emilio married 1982. Left employment suddenly, 1983. Rosa's hand trembled as she pointed to the note. They got married. Graham leaned closer, his brow furrowing. And then they left. Why? The archivist, a kindly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, overheard them and chimed in. If they left suddenly, it might be in the family's correspondence. They kept detailed notes on their employees. She retrieved a stack of yellowed letters, and Rosa and Graham sifted through them. One letter, dated June 1983, caught their attention. It was addressed to the head of the household from an investigator. Sir, per your request, I have verified that Marisol and Emilio have taken residence in a modest neighborhood on the city outskirts. They are raising a child, though its origins remain unclear. Recommend further investigation if deemed necessary. The words sent a chill through Rosa. A child, she murmured. Not me. Someone else. Graham's expression grew grim. Whatever happened after this letter might explain why she never returned to San Jacinto. We need to find out who this child was. Their search led them to the neighborhood mentioned in the letter, though decades of change had reshaped it. After hours of asking questions and knocking on doors, they found an elderly man named Hector who remembered Emilio and Marisol. They were good people, Hector said, his voice rasping with age. Kept to themselves, mostly. Emilio drove a car for a living. Marisol worked as a seamstress after she left her old job. Rosa leaned forward. Do you remember a child? A baby? Hector nodded slowly. Yes, a little boy. Their son, I think. They called him Miguel. Rosa's heart sank. A brother. She had a brother she had never known. What happened to them? Graham asked. Hector's face clouded with sorrow. It was tragic. There was an accident. A fire. Emilio and Marisol didn't make it. The boy survived, but I don't know what became of him. Rosa's chest tightened as tears filled her eyes. The weight of her mother's loss hit her anew. Where was the boy taken? Hector shook his head. I don't know, but someone from the church might. They helped after the fire. Rosa and Graham visited the church, where they found a nun who had been there at the time. Sister Beatrice listened carefully as they explained their search, her eyes softening with understanding. Miguel was taken in by an orphanage, she said. It was common in those days. Many children were placed in new homes far away. Do you know where he is now? Rosa asked, her voice trembling. Sister Beatrice shook her head. I don't, but I can give you the name of the orphanage. They might have records. Rosa nodded, her resolve hardening. Thank you. That night, Rosa sat in her apartment, staring at the photograph of Marisol, Emilio, and the child. A brother. She had a brother. And for the first time, she realized that the story she was uncovering wasn't just about her mother's choices. It was about a family she never knew existed, a family torn apart before it could truly begin. Graham called, his voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Rosa, are you all right? I don't know, she admitted. I never thought I'd have more family. And now it feels like I've lost them before I even knew them. You haven't lost them, Graham said firmly. Not yet. We're going to find him. We're going to find Miguel. His words felt like a lifeline in the dark. Thank you, Graham, for everything. The silence between them was charged, not with words, but with a shared understanding that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Rosa made a silent vow. She would find Miguel. She would piece together the life her mother had fought so hard to create, even if it had slipped through her fingers. And in doing so, she hoped to heal not only her wounds, but also those of the man who had become an unexpected ally in her journey. The orphanage Sister Beatrice had mentioned was located in a neighboring city, its faded brick exterior a testament to decades of housing forgotten stories. Rosa and Graham arrived early in the morning, the sun casting long shadows across the courtyard as children played with worn toys and kicked a deflated soccer ball. The sight pulled at Rosa's heart, a stark reminder of the childhood her brother might have endured. Inside, they were greeted by Sister Clara, a stout woman with kind eyes and a brisk manner. She listened patiently as Rosa explained their purpose, her gaze softening as the story unfolded. "Miguel," Sister Clara murmured, nodding thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember him. He came here as a baby, after the fire." Rosa's breath hitched. "Do you know what happened to him?" Sister Clara reached for an old ledger, its leather cover cracked and frayed. She flipped through the pages carefully, her finger tracing faded entries. Finally, she stopped and read aloud. "Miguel Delgado, adopted in 1984 by a couple in Monterrey. He would have been about 3 years old." Rosa's chest tightened. "Monterrey? Do you have their names?" Sister Clara nodded, scribbling the information onto a slip of paper. "Here, this is all we have." Rosa took the paper with shaking hands, the names blurring as tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you." The drive to Monterrey was tense, the weight of possibility hanging over them. Rosa held the slip of paper tightly, as though afraid it might vanish. Graham glanced at her from time to time, his concern evident. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. Rosa shook her head. "I'm not alone. You're here." Her words seemed to surprise him, and for a moment, the intensity of his gaze made her heart skip. But she turned back to the window, unwilling to confront whatever emotions were stirring between them. The address led them to a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. Rosa hesitated at the gate, her nerves fraying with every passing second. What if they were wrong? What if Miguel didn't want to be found? Graham placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll face it together." Taking a deep breath, Rosa knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman answered, her expression wary but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked. Rosa's voice trembled. "My name is Rosa Martinez. I'm looking for Miguel Delgado. I believe he might have been adopted by your family." The woman's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Miguel? Are you? Wait here." She disappeared inside, and Rosa's heart pounded in the silence. Moments later, a man appeared. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair peppered with gray and eyes that mirrored her own. "I'm Miguel," he said, his voice cautious but steady. "Who are you?" Rosa struggled to find the words, her throat tightening. "I'm your sister." Miguel stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "My sister? That's not possible." "It is," Rosa said, her voice cracking. "Our mother was Marisol. She left me in San Jacinto when I was a baby. I didn't even know you existed until now." Miguel's breath caught, and he stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Marisol," he murmured, the name unfamiliar on his lips. "I was adopted when I was a baby. I never knew." "She loved you," Rosa said quickly, tears streaming down her face. "She loved both of us. I have a letter she wrote. She wanted to give us a better life, but she didn't have a chance." The walls Miguel had spent years building around his past seemed to crack. He gestured for them to come inside, his movements stiff with emotion. In the living room, he sat across from Rosa, his hands clasped tightly. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For hours, Rosa and Graham recounted what they had learned about Marisol's life and the circumstances that had separated them. Miguel listened intently, his expression a mix of wonder, grief, and anger. "I always felt like something was missing," he admitted. Even with my adoptive parents, who were wonderful, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong. You belong with us, Rosa said firmly. With me. Miguel smiled faintly, the first hint of warmth breaking through his guarded demeanor. I don't even know you, but we'll change that, Rosa promised, her voice filled with determination. Later that night, Graham stood on the balcony of their hotel room, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. Rosa joined him, her face still flushed from the day's emotions. Thank you, she said softly. He turned to her, his brow furrowed. For what? For everything, she said. For helping me find him. For being here. Graham's expression softened, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. You've done more for me than you realize, he said. This journey, it's helped me too. Rosa tilted her head, studying him. What do you mean? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the city below. For years, I carried the guilt of losing Marisol. I thought I failed her. But helping you, it's given me a chance to honor her, to make things right. Rosa reached out, placing her hand over his. You didn't fail her, Graham. And you're not failing now. Their eyes met, and in that moment, unspoken emotions passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, and something deeper neither was ready to name. As Rosa drifted to sleep that night, her heart felt fuller than it had in years. She had found a brother, uncovered pieces of her mother's story, and forged an unexpected bond with a man who had once been a stranger. But she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, wounds to heal, and a future to rebuild. The next morning, Miguel invited Rosa and Graham to join him for breakfast. The air between them was lighter than the previous day, though a trace of awkwardness remained. Miguel, still processing the sudden appearance of a sister, seemed eager yet cautious. So, he began, sipping his coffee. What was she like? Marisol. I mean, our mother. Rosa's heart ached at the question. I only knew her as a child, but everyone says she was kind, strong, and determined. She worked so hard to give us a better future, even though she couldn't be with us. Miguel nodded slowly, his eyes distant. It's strange. I've always wondered where I came from, who I really was, but I never thought I'd have an answer. You have more than an answer, Graham interjected. You have a family. Miguel glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. And you? How do you fit into this? Graham hesitated, then spoke with quiet honesty. Marisol was like a mother to me, too. She worked for my family when I was a child. She was the only one who ever really cared about me. Losing her, it left a hole I've never been able to fill. Miguel studied him, his expression softening. You're not just here for Rosa, are you? No, Graham admitted. I'm here because Marisol meant everything to me, and because helping Rosa is the only way I can honor her memory. The sincerity in his voice seemed to break through Miguel's defenses. Well, Miguel said after a pause, thank you for helping us find each other. As the day wore on, Miguel opened up more, sharing fragments of his life. His adoptive parents had been kind but distant, their focus on providing stability rather than emotional closeness. He had grown up feeling like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, always yearning for something he couldn't name. Rosa listened intently, her heart breaking for the brother she had only just found. You're not alone anymore, she said, her voice firm. We're in this together now. Miguel smiled faintly. It's strange how quickly everything changes. A week ago, I didn't even know you existed. Now it feels like maybe I've been waiting for this my whole life. That evening, Rosa and Graham returned to the hotel. Rosa felt a sense of relief and purpose, but also a gnawing sense of unfinished business. Miguel was only part of the puzzle. There were still unanswered questions about Marisol and the circumstances that had kept her from returning to San Jacinto. Graham seemed to sense her unease. What's on your mind? He asked as they sat in the quiet of the hotel lounge. Rosa hesitated, then spoke. I'm happy we found Miguel, but I can't stop thinking about my mother. I need to understand why she stayed in the city, why she never came back. Graham nodded. You're right. There's more to the story. We need to go deeper. Rosa glanced at him, her eyes searching his. You don't have to keep doing this, you know. You've done so much already. Graham's gaze softened. Rosa, this isn't just about Marisol or Miguel. It's about you. I care about what happens to you. Her breath caught at his words, the warmth in his voice catching her off guard. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Instead, she simply nodded, her heart full of emotions she wasn't ready to name. The next day, they began tracing the events surrounding the fire that had claimed Marisol and Emilio's lives. Miguel provided a lead. An old family friend who had known his adoptive parents and might remember details about the tragedy. The friend, a retired firefighter named Roberto, welcomed them into his modest home. His weathered face lit up with recognition when he saw Miguel. Ah, little Miguelito, he said with a chuckle. Not so little anymore, eh? Miguel smiled, though the nickname made him blush. I'm looking for answers, Roberto. About the fire. About my parents. Roberto's expression grew serious. I remember that fire like it was yesterday, he said, leaning back in his chair. It was devastating. Your parents were good people. But something about it never sat right with me. What do you mean? Rosa asked, leaning forward. Roberto hesitated, his brow furrowing. There were rumors. Some said the fire wasn't an accident, that someone started it. The words sent a chill through the room. Rosa exchanged a look with Graham, her heart pounding. Why would anyone do that? Miguel asked, his voice tight. Roberto sighed. Your father, Emilio, he had a falling out with someone he worked for. A wealthy man who didn't take kindly to being crossed. Some folks said Emilio had uncovered something he shouldn't have. Others thought it was about Marisol. She was a strong woman, and not everyone liked that. The implications hung heavy in the air. Rosa's mind raced. Could Marisol and Emilio have been targeted? And if so, why? Do you know who this man was? Graham asked, his tone sharp. Roberto nodded slowly. His name was Carlos Ortega. He owned half the city back then. He was powerful and ruthless. If he wanted something, he got it. And if he wanted someone out of the way, well, you can guess the rest. As they left Roberto's house, the weight of his words pressed down on Rosa. The fire that had stolen her mother's life might not have been a tragedy of fate, but a deliberate act of cruelty. We need to find this Carlos Ortega, Rosa said, her voice trembling with determination. Graham placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steadying. We will. And when we do, we'll make sure the truth comes out. Miguel, who had been silent for most of the drive back, finally spoke. If Ortega was responsible for what happened to our parents, he needs to be held accountable. Rosa nodded, her heart burning with a mix of anger and resolve. For the first time, she felt the strength of her family, fractured and scattered as it had been, gathering around her like a protective shield. They weren't just searching for answers anymore. They were fighting for justice. The search for Carlos Ortega proved to be more daunting than Rosa, Graham, and Miguel anticipated. Though his name once wielded power and fear, decades had passed, and the man had seemingly vanished. Graham's resources proved invaluable. His network of contacts pulling at threads Rosa and Miguel wouldn't have known existed. 3 days later, Graham's assistant, Daniel, delivered a breakthrough. I found him, Daniel announced, walking into Graham's office with a folder in hand. Carlos Ortega retired years ago. He lives in a secluded estate just outside the city. Rosa's pulse quickened as Graham opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of an elderly man, his face lined with age but still sharp, his eyes dark and calculating. Alongside it were details about his estate and his few remaining connections. Miguel leaned over Rosa's shoulder to look at the file. He doesn't look so powerful now, he muttered. Looks can be deceiving, Graham said, his tone cautious. If Ortega is the kind of man Roberto described, he won't give us answers willingly. Rosa nodded, her jaw tightening. Then we'll have to make him. The estate was sprawling, surrounded by tall iron gates and thick hedges. Rosa and Miguel sat in Graham's car, the tension palpable as they waited for the gates to open. Graham had arranged for a meeting under the guise of discussing a potential business deal, leveraging his wealth to gain access. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, Rosa's hands clenched tightly in her lap. Beside her, Miguel stared out the window, his jaw set. "This is it," Graham said as they approached the house. "Are you ready?" Rosa nodded, though her heart raced. "We have to be." Carlos Ortega greeted them in a grand sitting room, his demeanor cold but polite. His once powerful frame had diminished with age, but his presence still carried an air of authority. "What brings you to my home?" Ortega asked, his voice gravelly but sharp. His gaze lingered on Graham, clearly sizing him up. Graham spoke first, his tone calm and measured. "Thank you for meeting with us, Mr. Ortega. This is more of a personal matter than a business one." Ortega raised an eyebrow. "Personal?" Rosa leaned forward, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We're here to talk about Marisol and Emilio Delgado." At the mention of their names, a flicker of recognition crossed Ortega's face, quickly masked by indifference. "I'm afraid I don't recall those names." Rosa's fists clenched. "They worked for you. Emilio was your driver, and Marisol was your housekeeper. They died in a fire that wasn't an accident." Ortega's expression hardened. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Miguel, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his voice laced with anger. "Don't lie to us. We know you had something to do with it. Roberto told us everything." Ortega's lips thinned. "That old fool doesn't know what he's talking about." "Then why did Emilio and Marisol leave your employment so suddenly?" Rosa pressed. "Why did someone feel the need to investigate them?" Ortega's eyes narrowed. "You're making baseless accusations." Graham leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "We're not here to accuse you, Mr. Ortega. We're here for the truth. If you had no part in what happened, then tell us who did." Ortega's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room was heavy with silence. Then he exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You're wasting your time." "No," Rosa said, her voice breaking. "We're trying to understand why our mother, why Marisol had to die. She left us. She promised to come back, but she couldn't because someone took that chance from her." For the first time, Ortega's expression faltered. He looked at Rosa, his gaze lingering as though seeing something, or someone, familiar. "She was strong," Ortega said at last, his voice quieter now. "Too strong for her own good." Rosa's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Ortega hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "Emilio found something he shouldn't have. Documents. Proof of deals I made. Things that wouldn't have held up under scrutiny. He threatened to take them to the authorities. I warned him to leave it alone, but he didn't listen." Miguel's fists clenched. "So you killed him?" "I didn't kill anyone," Ortega snapped. "But I had to protect myself. I hired someone to scare them to make sure they left the city. But things got out of hand." "Out of hand," Rosa repeated, her voice shaking with rage. "You mean the fire?" Ortega didn't respond, his silence confirming the truth. Rosa stood, her entire body trembling. "You destroyed our family. You killed them because they stood up to you." Ortega's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "I didn't mean for them to die. I only wanted them gone." "Gone?" Miguel spat, standing beside Rosa. "You didn't just make them gone. You took everything from us." The confrontation ended with little resolution. Ortega refused to admit more, his guilt evident but his words carefully measured. Rosa and Miguel left the estate with more anger than closure, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Back in the car, Miguel broke the silence. "He should pay for what he did." "He will," Graham said. "I'll make sure of it." Rosa stared out the window, tears streaming silently down her face. "It doesn't bring them back." "No," Graham said softly, "but it gives you the truth, and that's a start." That night, Rosa sat in her hotel room, the weight of the day crashing down on her. Graham knocked softly on the door, and she let him in without a word. He sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "Are you all right?" "No," she admitted. "But I will be." Graham placed a hand over hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "You're stronger than you know, Rosa, and you're not alone in this." For the first time, Rosa allowed herself to lean into the comfort he offered, her tears falling freely as he held her. Together, they faced the darkness, knowing that while the past couldn't be undone, the future was theirs to rebuild. The days following their confrontation with Carlos Ortega were turbulent for Rosa, Miguel, and Graham. The truth weighed heavily on them, not only as a revelation but as a call to action. Rosa and Miguel, united in their grief and anger, decided they couldn't let Ortega's actions go unpunished. Graham had already set things in motion. His legal team began poring over every available document linked to Ortega's past dealings. Though decades had passed, Graham's resources and persistence unearthed a trail of corruption, backdoor deals, and unspeakable crimes that Ortega had left in his wake. "This is bigger than just your family," Graham told Rosa and Miguel as they sat in his office one evening. "If we expose this, it could bring down everything Ortega built." Rosa glanced at her brother, who nodded resolutely. "He needs to answer for what he's done. Not just to us, but to everyone he's hurt." Graham leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then let's make it happen." The process was grueling. Rosa and Miguel gave statements to authorities, recounting what they had learned about their parents' deaths and Ortega's involvement. Graham's lawyers gathered evidence, while journalists began circling the story, eager to bring a powerful man's secrets to light. Despite the momentum, Rosa struggled with a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was driven by the need for justice. On the other, the fight dredged up painful memories of her mother and the life they had lost. One evening, as Rosa and Graham worked late in his office, she leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched into her face. "Do you ever feel like this will never be enough?" she asked, her voice quiet. Graham looked up from his laptop, his expression softening. "What do you mean? Even if we expose him, even if he goes to prison, it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't erase what he did." Graham set his work aside and moved to sit beside her. "You're right. It doesn't. But it gives you something she didn't have, a voice. And it shows people like Ortega that they can't get away with this forever." Rosa nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "I just wish she could see us now." "She'd be proud of you," Graham said firmly. "Both of you. You've come so far, and you're doing what she couldn't." His words settled over her like a balm, soothing the raw ache in her chest. Meanwhile, Miguel struggled with his own feelings of anger and loss. One afternoon, as he and Rosa visited the site of the fire where their parents had died, he stood silently for a long time, staring at the barren lot. "I don't remember them," he admitted finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Not really, but I feel like I've been carrying this emptiness my whole life." Rosa reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. We'll carry it together." Miguel glanced at her, his expression softening. "Thank you for finding me, for not giving up." "I couldn't," Rosa said, her voice breaking. "You're my brother." The tide turned when one of Ortega's former associates came forward, corroborating the claims about his involvement in the fire. The evidence, combined with Ortega's long history of corruption, led to a formal investigation. When Ortega was finally arrested, Rosa and Miguel watched the news coverage in silence. Seeing the man who had caused their family so much pain being led away in handcuffs brought a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of loss. "It's over," Miguel said quietly. Rosa shook her head. "No, it's not. But it's a start." With Ortega's downfall, the pieces of Rosa's and Miguel's lives began to fall into place. They visited their parents' graves together, laying flowers and speaking the words they had never been able to say. "I forgive you, Mama," Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. "I understand now, and I'll make sure your story is never forgotten." Miguel placed a hand on the gravestone, his voice steady. "Thank you for fighting for us. We'll take it from here." As the weeks turned into months, Rosa and Miguel worked to rebuild the family they had lost. Miguel visited San Jacinto, reconnecting with the roots he had never known. Rosa, in turn, began to open her heart to the idea of a future not defined by her past. Through it all, Graham remained by Rosa's side. Their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated, shaped by shared loss and a mutual desire to honor Marisol's memory. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Rosa's apartment, Graham handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" Rosa asked, her brow furrowing. "Open it," Graham said, his tone warm. Inside was a deed to a modest but beautiful property in San Jacinto. A place Rosa could call her own. A place where she could reconnect with her roots while building a future for herself and Mateo. "I thought you might need a fresh start," Graham said softly. Rosa stared at the paper, her eyes welling with tears. "Graham, I can't accept this." "You can," he said firmly. "And you should. This isn't just about the past, Rosa. It's about what comes next." For the first time in months, Rosa felt the weight on her heart begin to lift. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "For everything." Graham smiled, his gaze steady. "You're not alone anymore, Rosa. Remember that." The journey had been long and painful, but as Rosa stood with Graham that night, she felt a flicker of hope, a belief that, despite everything, life could be beautiful again. The property Graham had gifted Rosa in San Jacinto became a sanctuary, not just for her, but for her entire family. It sat on the edge of the village, overlooking rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, the air filled with the scent of citrus trees and the soft hum of life. It wasn't grand, but it was perfect. A place where the past and future could meet, where healing could take root. Rosa decided to move there with Mateo, who welcomed the change with surprising enthusiasm. "It feels like a fresh start," he said as they unpacked boxes in the small but cozy house. "Like we're part of something bigger now." Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Her son's resilience was a constant source of strength. Miguel visited often, his bond with Rosa deepening as they navigated their shared grief and newfound siblinghood. Together, they worked to preserve their parents' memory, collecting stories and photographs from anyone who had known Marisol and Emilio. These mementos filled the small living room, creating a tapestry of the life their parents had fought so hard to build. Graham became a frequent visitor as well, his presence a quiet but steady comfort. He helped oversee the renovations to the property, turning the house into a true home. Though he often downplayed his role, Rosa knew how much of his heart he had poured into helping her rebuild. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Graham and Rosa sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of gold and violet. The silence between them was warm, filled with unspoken understanding. "You've done so much for me," Rosa said, breaking the quiet. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Graham replied, his voice soft. "This isn't about repayment. It's about doing what feels right." Rosa turned to him, her gaze searching his. "Why? Why do you care so much?" He hesitated, as though weighing his words. "Because you've reminded me what it means to care about something bigger than myself. I spent so much of my life chasing success, thinking it would fill the emptiness. But it didn't. You did." Her breath caught, the raw honesty of his words catching her off guard. "Graham," he smiled faintly, shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." As the months passed, the pain of the past began to soften, replaced by the warmth of new beginnings. Rosa and Miguel worked with local leaders to establish a community center in San Jacinto, dedicated to the memory of Marisol and Emilio. The center provided resources for single parents and underserved children, ensuring that no one else in the village would have to make the same sacrifices their parents had. The grand opening was a day of celebration, filled with laughter, music, and a sense of unity. Rosa stood at the front of the crowd, her voice strong and steady as she spoke about her parents' legacy. "They taught us the value of love, resilience, and hope," she said. "This center is a testament to their spirit, a reminder that even in the face of hardship, we can create something beautiful." The applause that followed was thunderous, But what stayed with Rosa was the sight of Miguel standing beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and Graham watching from the back, his eyes filled with quiet pride. As the night wound down, Rosa found Graham standing beneath a tree, the soft glow of lanterns casting shadows across his face. She approached him, her heart full. "You never told me why you stayed," she said, her voice gentle. He looked at her, his expression tender. "I stayed because you gave me a reason to." For the first time, Rosa allowed herself to acknowledge what had been growing between them. An unspoken connection forged in grief, strengthened by shared purpose, and deepened by the quiet moments they had spent together. "Graham," she began, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I'm here." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "And I'm grateful for that. For you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them beneath the starlit sky. In the months that followed, Rosa's life blossomed in ways she had never imagined. Her bond with Miguel grew stronger, their shared mission bringing a sense of purpose she hadn't known she needed. Mateo thrived in the village, his dreams of becoming an architect reignited by the beauty of their surroundings. And Graham, true to his word, remained a constant presence. A friend, a partner, and perhaps something more. One evening, as Rosa sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Mateo beside her, she reflected on how far they had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed, becoming a part of the foundation on which they were building their future. "I think she'd be proud of us," Mateo said, breaking the silence. Rosa smiled, her heart swelling. "I think so too." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Rosa felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road that had brought her here had been long and painful, but it had also been filled with love, resilience, and unexpected blessings. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to move forward, toward a future filled with hope, purpose, and the quiet, steady promise of better days ahead.